Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Khalil Jahshan from Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome you to this special webinar, The U.S. Role in Israel's War on Iran, Regional and Global Implications. As Israel's war on Iran that began, as you all remember, on June 13 this year intensified, the U.S. at Israel's urging and lobbying became directly involved by launching its own strikes against three primary sites in Iran, namely Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The U.S. participation in the war, which began a couple of days later on the 21st, has accelerated the region's slide, from my perspective, toward a broader conflict of far-reaching global consequences. Although the U.S. has announced a fragile ceasefire, almost some kind of surprising announcement, as if it's a unilateral decision, it was promptly accepted by both antagonists, Iran and Israel. But still, here we are, days after that. No one knows its precise content or sustainability. The debate in Washington is continuing this morning about whether the ceasefire is going to stay or not. It is holding thus far, and personally, I hope it will hold to save lives on all sides. But again, it's a legitimate question that is still begging for an answer. So far, public pronouncements by the Trump administration about its rationale for the war, its the actual implementation of the war or the raids, the success or failure of these raids have raised more questions than answers. A key in point, just this morning, we watched here in Washington a press conference held by Defense Secretary Peter Hegseth and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, in which they attempted to set the record straight by releasing maybe a few more details about the war. But frankly, they fell short of answering the myriad of outstanding questions raised by the media, members of Congress, analysts, think tanks, as well as the American public at large. So to help tackle some of these questions, Arab Center Washington, D.C. is convening this webinar to discuss the role of the United States in this conflict, the scope of its involvement, and the strategic goals it is hoping to achieve. Panelists and experts will analyze how the Trump administration's actions are shaping the trajectory of the war and influencing regional dynamics in the Middle East, as well as global security and economic stability. Before I introduce our special guests, I would like to again say that we do have, as always, a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. 30 minutes will be dedicated to that. So feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom page to send your questions anytime during the discussion or the presentations. And also you can email your questions if you care to do so to email at arabcenterdc.org, email@arabcenterdc.org. We're going to begin with a keynote remarks to kind of set the parameters for our discussion today by our special friend, guest, Hamid Dabashi, who is the Hagop Kevorkian Professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. He's a well-known author and academic expert on Iran and U.S.-Iranian relations. And he's also, we're proud to say, member of the Academic Advisory Board at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Hamid will be followed by remarks also by Mehran Kamrava, the Director of Iranian Studies Unit at Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and Professor of Government at Georgetown University in Qatar. Mehran will be followed by Assal Rad, who is a non-resident fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and also a nationally known scholar of Middle East history. She will be followed by Dan Brumberg, Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University, non-resident senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., And last but not least, our dear friend Barbara Slavin, Distinguished Fellow, Middle East and North Africa at the Stimson Center and lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University. With your permission, let's go ahead and begin. Professor Dabashi, the microphone is yours if you would like to activate your mic and proceed.
Thank you, Khalil. Thank you for inviting me. Delighted to see all of my colleagues, Daniel, Mehran, Assal, and Barbara, whom I haven't seen forever. Great scholars, colleagues whom I deeply admire and read. In particular, Assal, I'm a great fan of those quick things that you were doing during the Gaza. Bravo. Now, as to the question of Israeli military invasion against Iran, followed by US entering the war scene, first of all, I don't think US was outside the scene. US was behind the scene, very much involved, logistically, militarily, etc., as were the European powers, as in fact were some of the regional Arab domains part of this operation, both in facilitating the Israeli attack and also to help protect Israel against the Iranian counteroffensive. As you know, we are too close to the event. Right now, whatever we are saying or seeing, we're assimilating them backward into what we already know. But I completely agree with Khalil that this is the beginning of a new epistemic change. What precisely are the parameters of those epistemic change need to be ascertained and articulated in a responsible way. But from where I stand right now, I am absolutely convinced from the second that the first bomb was dropped on Iranian sites, any one of these three sites, or Tehran, or the leadership, military leadership and scientific leadership were assassinated, etc., the very second Iranian drive to develop an atom bomb was in motion. Right now, we are 2 weeks closer to the development of a nuclear armament, militarization of the capacity of Iranian nuclear technology, nuclear material towards the construction of a bomb. As we saw, the fact is that two nuclear powers, one of them had actually dropped nuclear bomb on other people, invaded a country that does not have nuclear bomb, is a signatory to NPT, is a signatory, it is constantly under supervision of United Nations Atomic Energy. So we have an imbalance of fact. Now, but there is no doubt in my mind that Iranians will move towards weaponization of their nuclear program. In what particular way, it remains to be seen. There are multiple sites for us to reconsider. Iran itself, its internal dynamics, its relationship between Iran and other states around it is one scene. US is another scene. Over the last 2 or 3 weeks, those of us who follow the news closely, we know that inside the United States, there is now the emergence of a new site of resistance to the US involvement in the geopolitics of the region, particularly being manipulated by Israel into entering war. And if those who are actively supporting US involvement with Israel thought the presence of a group of innocent students on their campuses opposing genocide was their problem and tried to silence and sabotage and demonize it, now the rise of a significant base of Donald Trump's support and their refusal, if you were to listen to people like Tucker Carlson and others, the way they are beginning to question this wholehearted support for Israel, that's another scene domestic to United States. We have seen inside Iran, inside US, and also, of course, in the region, the Iranian targeting the US military base in Qatar is a particularly important development. Iran and Qatar have a very friendly relationship. During the boycott and sanction of Qatar, Iran was a chief supporter of Qatar. And Qatar has had a major role to play in facilitating conversation between Iran and US and et cetera. So this is a especially important development. But to me, the single most important factor is Gaza. In my opinion, this war was launched by Israel in order to distract attention from what is happening in Gaza. That's the epicenter of the event. So we need to have all of these compartments, Iran, US, the region, Europeans, the Gulf context and theater, in order to see, analyze them and then synthesize them. Now, if I were to just say a few things about Iran itself, so far as Iran is concerned, in my opinion, the ruling regime survived this attack. Any attempt to, this morning I listened to Khamenei's 13-minute speech, which was up to date until the attack on the military base. The regime is in no shape or form is about to collapse, will not collapse. No democracy, if the point is democracy, will come under the pressure of bombs and military strikes. If anything, it would become like a porcupine. All its defensive spikes will come out and become more defensive. And so far as aspirations of Iranians for democracy is concerned, perfectly legitimate aspirations. But as we saw in the course of the last 2 weeks, suddenly everybody dropped their opposition, myself included. I cannot step in my own country because of my position. We all dropped because the nature of Iranian commitment to their homeland transcends ideology. In fact, Iran as a nation takes possession of the sovereignty of the nation. It gives it as loan to any government that comes and goes, but it is Iranian people themselves. Now, having said that, immediately you are reminded of people gathered around Reza Pahlavi and his cohorts who think that US and Israel will destroy the ruling regime in Iran and bring them to power the way that the CIA MI6 coup of 1953 brought their father back to power. But I don't think that will happen. If anything, right now, in my opinion, a soft military coup that the Sepah Pastaran will stage is far more possible than any move towards any democratic direction. Now, this morning, there were two essays. I will say this and conclude. There was two essays in opinion page of New York Times, one by Vali Nasr and one by Wallace Wells. Vali Nasr is a political scientist, very learned and insightful political scientist. Basically, he's telling his readers that following a logic of ambiguity, Iran will eventually move towards weaponization of their nuclear capacities. So it is looking at it from a perspective of the ruling regime inside Iran. Whereas Wallace Wells' piece is very important because it, in fact, is saying what I have said, but in a different direction. Namely, Netanyahu's and the ruling regime in Israel's attack on Iran was distract from genocide in Gaza, which is now paramount on global consciousness. Wallace Wells' argument is that he has succeeded, and the concern of global scene about genocide, that you have had multiple manifestations of it, people have forgotten about that because now they are thinking of Iran. I don't think that is the case. And to make my point clear, I'd like to open up with two events, namely the beginning of US involvement targeting Iranian sites on 22nd of June and concluding it on 24th or 23rd. I want to augment them with two domestic affairs. The day that US began to bomb Iran, Khalil, the graduate students from Columbia who was arrested by Rice, was released from Rice detention. He came back to New York, saw his son, his child after 3 months, went to the street and started demonstrating. The second event, which is equally important, the day that Donald Trump declared that ceasefire, we had Mamdani's triumph as a mayoral candidate here in New York. Why are they important? They are important because of a magnificent central text that Amy Kaplan, our late colleague in English department, wrote called Empire and Anarchy, in which she argues the connection between foreign policy and domestic policy. Whereas invading Iran or negotiating a peace treaty is foreign policy, the fact that the legal apparatus within the United States has triumphed for Khalil Mahmoud to be released from Rice detention is an indication that there are aspects of American constitutional protection of habeas corpus that are still at work. The surprise success of Zohran Mamdani, the son of my own distinguished colleague, Mahmoud and Mira Nair, is an indication that the corruption of the Democratic Party that extends from all the past presidents, in which during the Democratic Convention, Kamala Harris would not allow even a Palestinian to utter a sentence during the convention. Here in New York, you have a candidate that won with a decisive victory who is unapologetically pro-Palestinian and unapologetically critical of Israel as an apartheid state. In other words, if we follow Amy Kaplan's wisdom and insight and bring domestic American and global context of these warfares together, the decision is much more open-ended. The role of democratic and progressive forces and movements within United States and outside United States are far more relevant than we sit there and simply wait for Israel or US to do something and start analyzing it. I think we need to look forward and to see what are the democratic and progressive forces at work. If we do that, we are, I believe, closer to what is happening rather than just simply analyzing and mourning or what people in position of power can do. I'll stop here and look forward to hearing to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Hamid, for your remarks. Plenty of food for thought here, and I'm sure we will be commenting about some of these points that you have raised throughout this webinar. Let's go ahead and proceed with the panel discussion now. And our first speaker in the panel is Mehran Kamrava. Mehran, the microphone is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Khalil. First, let me also thank you and the rest of the team at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. for this honor to be here with you and to be in such a distinguished panel. Again, colleagues I have learned from and read and cited for a number of years. I wanted to say a couple of things about the consequences of the conflict for Iran's domestic politics and particularly for Iranian security policy. But let me start very quickly and briefly by talking about Israel's endgame in attacking Iran. Of course, the stated objective of Israel was to destroy Iran's nuclear program. And what we see is that over the course of the 12 days in which the conflict unfolded, Israel's objectives evolved. And so it went from destroying only the nuclear program to then also destroying Iran's missile program. And then, of course, we had an op-ed piece in the Jerusalem Post that said that Israel and the United States ought to give security guarantees to Iran's different ethnic communities, the Arabs, the Baluch, and the Kurds, so that Iran as an entity would disintegrate or at least be tremendously weakened. And then, of course, towards the end of the conflict, we had the not very hidden objective of regime change. And we saw that particularly in the form of the attack on Evin prison, and not just buildings, but the main front gate of the central prison in Tehran, which was meant to really literally blast open the gates of the prison and enable the prisoners to escape and wreak havoc in the country. So in light of these developments, I think Iranian military commanders modulated their behavior. And let me just say a couple of things about the way they conducted the war, or some of the assumptions that guided their behavior during the conduct of the war. First and foremost, while they were keen on impressing upon the Israelis, the Iranians, and everyone else that they could defend the country, they were also keen to avoid escalation as much as possible. So what we had were counterattacks following Israeli attacks. The Iranians also prepared themselves, the military command that is, prepared itself for a prolonged war of attrition. And we saw this in the way that they went about attacking Israel. First with less sophisticated missiles and drones, and increasingly as the war dragged on, we saw more sophisticated Iranian missiles, more lethal, and of course at the very end we saw Khaybar missile on the 11th of the conflict and in the final hours. The one thing that was interesting for me was the almost complete absence of the regular military, the Artesh. And I think this was a question that many people asked: where is the regular military? And was it the fact that they were so sidelined, that they were not involved at all? Was this an indication of a new division of labor, whereby the Artesh would be focused on domestic security, while the Revolutionary Guards would be in charge of national security? Or was the Artesh indeed being spared, given this assumption of a prolonged end of conflict? Finally, the attack on Al-Udeid. Of course, Iran politically had to respond to America's attack on its 3 nuclear sites. And previously, it had attacked US bases in Iraq, and it only made sense for it to attack a US base outside of Iraq. For me, the attack on Al-Udeid base here in Qatar, about 30 kilometers actually from where I live, was an almost exact replica of Iran's attack following the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani in 2020, when the Iranians gave a 1-hour notice to the Iraqis, who in turn informed the Americans, and the Iranians were careful to inflict damage but try to avoid killing Americans. And again, similarly, this time they gave notice to the Qataris, and they attacked Al-Udeid in a way that was meant to be symbolic and send a strategic message, but not necessarily inflict major damage. Of course, they could have attacked other bases, but Al-Udeid is symbolically important because of its size, being the biggest US base in the Middle East, and also it would be easier to repair relations with Qatar, with whom Iran has had close relations, rather than with the Saudis and the Emiratis. Let me conclude, if I may, with some lessons for Iran. Professor Dabashi very brilliantly laid out some of the consequences, but let me just say a couple of things about Iran's domestic politics and its security landscape. A couple of important highlights to remind everyone of, that raise more questions than answers. But first and foremost, we know that in the heat of the war, Khomeini designated 3 successors, and importantly, those 3 successors did not include his son. So while he theoretically still does not abrogate the Constitution, which says that the Assembly of Experts ought to elect a supreme leader, nonetheless, he wanted to expedite those deliberations. So one important space to watch is kind of this leadership succession, particularly now that the war is over. Are those three successors still in play? We don't know who they are. The other question is the role and profile of the Revolutionary Guards, particularly when it comes to domestic politics. There is a serious question that everyone in Iran is asking. I think all of us are asking, how would the Iranian state react? Will it constrict political space even more? Because if it allows a little bit of freedom of expression, it would be opening a Pandora's box that it cannot contain. Or will it try to regain some of its lost legitimacy by opening up some social and political space? So we know, for example, yesterday there was a free concert at Azadi Square in Tehran. They very temporarily lifted some internet restrictions, although today they appear to have been back on. And of course, that's something to watch. Finally, I think Iran has a number of security factors that it needs to think through. I'm sure the IRGC and the Supreme National Security Council are thinking through these. First of all, how do you overcome vulnerabilities? When the United States president says we have complete control over Iranian skies, of course, that is important. Will the Revolutionary Guards be held accountable for its failure to defend Iranian airspace and to inflict, or at least to protect Iran from Israeli missiles? This also drives home the centrality of the missile program. We saw that Iran did, in fact, give Israel a bloody nose. None other than the US president has admitted that the missile program, Iranian missile program, was effective. But it also drives home the need for an air force, which Iran does not have. And I think that is, of course, quite important. Finally, I think, as Professor Dabashi mentioned, I think Iran is looking at new means of deterrence. Gone are the days of the axis of resistance, which was useful in its day, but it no longer exists, or it no longer is a factor. And of course, it's not just the Israelis that the Iranians are confronted with, but it's Israel and the United States. And I think this is a realization that the Revolutionary Guards came to, during this conflict. I'll stop here and hope to answer or enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Mehran, particularly for emphasizing, I think, what Hamid mentioned earlier, the new deterrence that is emerging and needs to be discussed carefully, and its implication for the so-called axis of resistance throughout the region, where they have played a key and visible role in regional politics for quite a few years. Whether they can sustain that, resume that, is subject to discussion. Assal, go ahead. The microphone is yours.
Thank you. I didn't know if Professor Dabashi had a comment because his hand was up. Nope. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see that.
I wanted to make sure. First, like everybody else, I would like to thank the Arab Center for organizing this and for having me to be included amongst people I respect and have followed for such a long time is really an honor. Professor Dabashi, many of your books are in the shelf in the background, which have been integral to my education on Iran. So thank you for that. In the question of the US role in Israel's war of aggression on Iran. And I call it a war of aggression because it is a war of aggression. Israel attacked Iran unprovoked, despite the media's efforts to call it a preemptive strike to create the illusion of an imminent threat. Iran did not pose an imminent threat, and therefore Israel's actions, like basically all of Israel's actions that we've seen, not just over the last 20 months, but over many decades, were illegal. And the reason I bring that up is because we also have to talk about the implications of what we've seen in the last 20 months for, and the US role in that, for the international system. If we're talking about the US role, I think we have to take a step back and realize that what we've seen in the last 2 weeks is not just a consequence of this administration. It is something that it was built over. It's a bipartisan project that has been built, again, not just by the last 2 administrations, but by every administration you can think of going back many decades. The fact that if you look at the Biden admin's handling of Israel, which was basically a green light to do anything that they wanted, to cross every red line that existed to the extent that a genocide is being committed. And I think something very important about what Professor Dabashi said, that is the central question that we should be talking about. Those red lines were all crossed before this administration took over. As we saw in Israel's invasion of Lebanon, we saw the same kinds of red lines being crossed here in its bombing campaign in Iran. If the idea is now that this is normalized, that any state can attack and bomb another sovereign state based on their political goals with no imminent threat, then the entire structure and architecture of the international system is gone. That's its most basic principle. Now, you can talk about all sorts of principles that are part of the international system, but I think the first sentence in the UN Charter is about avoiding the scourge of war, an institution that was founded in the wake of World War II. All of that is gone if there is no such thing as sovereignty. All of that is gone if you can just carry out bombing campaigns because you choose to either change governments, make up threats that don't exist, or you want to degrade their military and their ability to defend themselves. One of the ironies of the last 2 weeks and what we witnessed is it is in very many ways parallel to what Iran experienced in the 1980s war. And the entire logic of the Islamic Republic as to why they say they have to have certain weapons, why do they have to have a ballistic missiles program, why do they have to be able to defend themselves independently of any other country, is because in the 1980s, when they were invaded by Saddam Hussein, when they were invaded by Iraq, the international community did not come to the aid of Iran, even though it was the country that was invaded. What they just experienced was the exact parallel to that in a shorter term. Iran was the country that was attacked, and yet Iran was the country that was condemned by the very countries in the West that claim to be the champions of an international system that is meant to protect a country like Iran when it is under attack. So the role that the US plays in this is essentially Israel could not carry out the actions that it does without US support. In fact, Israeli officials have made this point themselves. Israel cannot act with such impunity without material and diplomatic support from the United States. So the US plays a central role in all of this. And I don't want to focus only on the Trump administration because this is not a Trump administration issue. This is a US foreign policy issue that goes back many decades. Now, going back to the central issue that I mentioned, the genocide in Gaza. There is a tendency to compartmentalize, in the West at least, to compartmentalize the Palestinian issue itself, treating Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the diaspora, all as separate issues, when in fact, these are all part of the same issue. You cannot talk about Gaza without talking about the West Bank. You cannot talk about East Jerusalem without talking about Gaza. It is impossible to do so because they are all Palestinians. And until the core issue in the region, which is the decades-long occupation that Israel has carried out against Palestinians, an apartheid state that cannot be a democracy, the policies that have gone to such an extreme that now we are watching live-streamed a genocide, the worst atrocities of this century that everyone can see and everyone can recognize, but it continues unabated. This cannot be separated from Israel's aggressions throughout the region. In part because the current Israeli government led by Netanyahu is hell-bent on creating destruction in the region, in many ways for his own domestic issues. He doesn't want to be held accountable within the Israeli court system. He wants to maintain his coalition and stay in power, and therefore he has to create this constant havoc in the region. And also because once the international system allowed Israel to act with no accountability, there is no red line. Why wouldn't Netanyahu attack any country that he wants? There's no one to hold him accountable. So I think there's another ultimate question that we should be asking. This isn't answering it, but this is raising the question, going back to the idea of the international system, which is clearly the system has failed. Maybe it made sense 80 years ago when it was created, but today it does not make sense because it cannot answer the problems of the day. The most central being, how do we allow a genocidal state to attack other sovereign states, and then within that system, the states that lead that system condemn not the genocidal state, not for its genocide, nor for its aggressions, but condemns the state that is being attacked? That is a system that has been completely inverted. It no longer serves any real purpose. And I think that is the larger implication of what we've seen in the last 20 months.
Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and move to Dan. The microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Khalil. I'm delighted to be on this panel and to see such wonderful colleagues join us here for this discussion. I want to begin by responding to something that Hamid said that I think is right on target in some respects, and that is the Israeli assault on Iran was in part done to distract attention. I would amplify and redefine that and say instead that, as far as I can tell, the Israeli assault was done not to distract attention so much, because attention was already distracted from Gaza, right? The international community was not paying attention. But as part of a strategy that Bibi and his allies, his own mullah allies, if I may say so, in the Israeli government, are pursuing to complete the job, right, whatever that is, in Gaza and in the West Bank. And therefore, from the perspective of the current Israeli government, wounding, damaging Iran's regional power, trying to bring down the government if at all possible, doing serious damage to Iran's nuclear infrastructure, its weaponization program, and so on, was not only a goal in and of itself, but was a goal that served its purpose, which was to create an environment by which Israel could turn from the war with Iran to the Gaza arena and have the wherewithal, the international context, the U.S. support to do whatever Bibi Netanyahu ultimately wants to achieve in Gaza, whether it's expelling 2 million people or imposing Israeli control or whatever. And of course, the ongoing situation in the West Bank is not quite as bad, but it's bad enough, right? So I think it's important to recognize that the real target here, from Bibi's perspective and those of his Messianic Jewish supporters in that government, was the situation in Gaza and the West Bank. And for that, they had to deal a serious blow to Iran. And I think that from Bibi's perspective, he's achieved that aim. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Yes, from the beginning, the Bibi government, as well as the U.S. government, had this fantasy of regime change in mind. They thought that by going after regime leaders, the security infrastructure, they could achieve that, but that clearly didn't happen. That was, I think, and remains a fantasy. But I have to say that we have to recognize that Israel achieved certain kinds of strategic, or at least tactical, objectives. Its objective was not only to assault the 3 targets that Hamid mentioned, but also to go over and attack Iran's weaponization program at various sites where this weaponization program has been hidden, more or less. There's a detailed report by the IAEA that was issued of all days on June 4th, which spells out in some detail where these programs exist and suggests that Iran had done its best to hide them and it had not fulfilled its obligations. This was a remarkable statement for that organization to make, but did suggest serious concerns about those weaponization programs and where Iran was going with that overall nuclear program. Israel's desire was to damage that program as much as possible. Whether it's had the reverse effect, of course, is something that we're all wondering about. But I think that was something that Israel had in mind. So And so we are left here with a situation, it's paradoxical. I think none of us predicted it. I think all of us worried about a long war of attrition, but we have a situation more by default than by design, in which all three key players are declaring some sort of victory, right? And from a kind of negotiations perspective, from a peacemaking perspective, that kind of situation would be ripe for some sort of diplomacy. If all actors can come out of this conflict saying, well, I've preserved my major assets. And I want to make this very clear. If Iran was in a situation where it was losing everything, it would have no reason to agree to a ceasefire. Iran's readiness to agree to a ceasefire is because it wants to retain many of the assets it still retains, right? And which the United States and Israel failed to obliterate, as Trump would put it. So there's a context that would be, under some circumstances, propitious for diplomacy and propitious for negotiations. But I don't think, and here I'll shift to the Trump administration. I'm not in Washington now, and Brumberg and many of my colleagues who are in Washington will have, in many respects, their finger on the pulse better than I do. But it does seem to me that we have to recognize that from the very beginning of the U.S. Involvement in the attack on Iran, Trump had no clear strategy. Trump is a man of impulse, of emotion, who sees every opportunity to express power domestically and globally is mostly about him and his own sort of emotional state. And I really, as reductionist as this seems, I think that's very important to understand. And therefore, he's a great improviser, right? And so he moved from speculating about a regime change to this and that, and finally sort of celebrating the so-called ceasefire, which he and Qatar, United States and Qatar played a role in bringing about, but without any clear strategy of where to move next, and certainly without any clear diplomatic strategy. The U.S. position remains probably that there can be zero enrichment, and that is the basis for an agreement, and that Iran rejected on principle and would still reject. So one has to ask ourselves, where is the President of the United States in terms of his ability to form that kind of coherent Iran strategy and place the results of these events in a context where the United States can actually secure some sort of diplomatic process. And I would only say, and I'll conclude here, that I'm not at all optimistic about this, given the absence of a strategy, given Trump's temperament, and given what Israel's objectives are. Iran comes out of this situation bloodied, for sure, figuratively and literally, with many of its assets severely damaged, how much we don't know. But nevertheless, precisely because Iran was not in a position where it had everything to lose, but it had everything to gain by retaining what it already had, or what remained of its assets, ready to sort of stand back and accept a ceasefire. But where we go from here is far from clear.
Good question. Where do we go from here? We hope to tackle this one a little bit more. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate that. Barbara, the microphone is yours. Would you like to begin with Dan's challenging question?
Where we go from here? Sure.
Where do we go from here?
Thank you all. Thank you to the Arab Center for inviting me. A great deal has been covered, and I don't want to repeat what my colleagues, my excellent colleagues, have said. But when the Israelis attacked Iran, I wrote a piece in which I bemoaned that there were no statesmen who could take this situation and devise some sort of genius, strategy that would pull us out of crisis and make opportunity out of calamity. And I'm afraid we're still in that situation. I mean, if you look back to the first Gulf War or the 67 war or the 73 war, there are no Kissingers, there are James Baker, even Colin Powell that would be sent to the region and somehow come up with a solution to this. Instead, you have the tweets of Donald Trump or the truths of Donald Trump on Truth Social, which seem to determine whether war is on or off. So I'm afraid I'm going to second what Dan said. Now, Donald Trump said that there were supposed to be some talks with Iran in the coming week. I've seen no confirmation from Iran, and I can't even imagine, frankly, that they would be willing at this point to sit down. And if they did, the demands would be the same, that Iran must have a civilian nuclear program, which includes enriching uranium on Iranian soil. Now, that might be a moot point, given the damage that's been done to the enrichment facilities, but Iran will not give up the right to enrich, which it believes it retains under the NPT. And instead, we have Parliament, and I think now also the Guardian Council, approving a resolution by Iran to stop cooperating with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which means we will not have really accurate and clear accounting for materials for enriched uranium. There are still reports that a lot of the 60% uranium was spirited away to another location before the attacks. And this is sort of the first shoe. And then the second shoe that might drop is leaving the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, whose anniversary is on July the 1st, by the way. And Iran, I believe, was the first to sign it under pressure from the United States, which wanted to cooperate with Iran and give it civilian nuclear technology on condition that Iran be an NPT member. So I think we're in a situation which is even more serious than what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in the West Bank, the fact that the shadow war broke out into the open in a big way, and that the United States, for the first time in 46 years, struck the Iranian homeland, something it had not done ever since the revolution. We're in a situation where the entire, not just the international legal framework, but in particular the non-proliferation framework, is in grave danger, because we all know that if Iran does rush for some sort of nuclear device, it won't be alone. It will be followed by the Saudis, by others in the region in short order. So there's a desperate need for diplomacy to try to stabilize the situation, for the US and Iran somehow to sit down again, but to talk about a realistic proposal. Not sure again that Steve Witkoff is capable of that, or even Michael Anton, who is supposed to be in charge of the technical details of this, as well as to end the war in Gaza. I've enjoyed, and I don't know if that's the right word, Assal's rewriting of newspaper headlines on the social platform X over the last many months, where somehow Palestinians mysteriously die, and it's not really clear who's killing them. Very interesting phraseology, I think that hopefully we can at least stabilize that situation, and stabilize the situation in the West Bank, and begin to repair the situation in the region, as well as this very tattered international framework. I did a webinar for Stimson Center donors and fat cats, that was off the record last week, and they kept saying, when will the Middle East be stable? And I said, it's never going to be stable until you resolve root causes. And the biggest root cause was the dispossession of the Palestinians. And as long as there are Palestinians, they will not give up the efforts to have some sort of independent homeland any more than the Jews gave up over 2,000 years their desire to return to their ancestral homeland. So, we can put Band-Aids here and there, we can have ceasefires here and there, but we have to deal with the root causes at some point. And this is a product of mistakes made by multiple administrations, and let's say Iran as well, for supporting militant groups instead of a peaceful resolution of the Palestinian issue. There's a lot of blame that falls on Iran, in my view, as well. And we have to acknowledge that in some sense they asked for this by chanting death to Israel and death to America for 46 years. Be that as it may, we have to begin to deal with root causes. And I share Dan's skepticism about the Trump administration, which is more and more like a cult of personality rather than administration, being able to come up with sensitive, thoughtful, realistic proposals that can actually begin to solve these root problems in the Middle East. And with that tirade, I will wait for questions and enjoy my colleagues' comments.
Thank you, Barbara. I agree with your comment there, a hint about Witkoff and his capabilities. But it seems to me if I may begin with this question, it looks like Trump is mimicking or repeating the advice he's getting from Witkoff. For example, one of the latest things we heard from the president, whether it was a tweet or what, most of them tend to be, but he was talking about possibility of additional expansion of normalization with Arab countries. And this was just last night, talking about as if like Arab countries are standing in line immediately now as a result of this war to establish relations with Israel. And I don't know where they are getting that impression. Do you have a comment on that?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see it. I mean, maybe my colleagues have a better idea. Who is going to normalize next with Israel after this demonstration of military might? I don't think Saudi Arabia is going to do it absent an end. I mean, I think if I recall the tweet correctly, it was premised on an end to the war in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And so, let's wait and see if there's actually an end to the war in Gaza before we can even begin to talk about this. And how does it end? And who is in charge? There was some reference to the Arabs, coming in and taking over, I think. I mean, there have been plans that have put together. The Egyptians put together a plan. But I haven't seen that Bibi Netanyahu is willing to give any authority to Palestinian technocrats or to the Palestinian Authority or whoever he thinks. I mean, the only people that Israel has empowered in Gaza are tribal clans and criminals, as far as I can tell.
Thank you, Barbara. I appreciate that. Dan, you have a comment to add to this? Microphone.
Sorry, if I may just interject for a moment here. I agree with Barbara. It has to be said, first of all, Trump has been Bibi's biggest enabler. When Trump said that 2 million Palestinians have to leave Gaza and go somewhere else in order to open up fantasy land of hotels or whatever he had in mind, and Bibi was sitting there, right? You all recall this. And he couldn't believe what he was hearing, but he was happy to hear it, right? This was the green light that I think really, from Bibi's perspective, has lit everything he's done so far, right? Has given him the green light. And that relates to the issue that Barbara just mentioned, and that is, look, the members of this particular government in Israel don't want normalization. They want land. They are messianic. They are committed to an ideology. We have to take that ideology very seriously. It's not a substitute for something else. And when they say they want to reconquer Gaza or expel Palestinians from the West Bank, they mean it. And under those circumstances, they don't want normalization with Saudi Arabia. That's not what they're after. They live in a different world, and their points of reference are different. And so they're not looking for that outcome. Now, Trump may want it, but he may not be fully cognizant of the fact that everything he's done so far has made that kind of image of extending the Abraham Accords to Saudi Arabia is simply impossible.
Thank you. Assal?
Well, I think Dan brought up a really important point about the ideological nature of it, because oddly enough, in our political discourse, certainly in the criticisms that you tend to see from world leaders or anything like that, it's as if this zealous ideological atmosphere does not exist in Israel, and that is not actually being manifested in concrete actions that have devastated Palestinians. So it's really important to bring up the ideological aspect and the fact that the Israel is an expansionist project. It's like it's never talked about that way, right? The way that you hear the framing in the West is always that, for instance, and since I'm coming back to our original topic, Iran is somehow always irrational and ideological. Iran is somehow an expansionist state, but Israel is just there being, peaceful while invading and occupying multiple countries in the region, and most importantly, continuously occupying Palestinian land. like continuous decades-long occupation is the crux of the story and then somehow always left out of the story, which is why it's so difficult to get into, a serious debate or conversation about what are the potential resolutions or what would be a peaceful architecture in the region, because we're not addressing the root cause. And the fact that that cause is ideologically driven by what is in fact an extremely irrational actor, which is Israel. Like, that's never a part of the conversation. I think it's so important that it becomes part of the conversation, because we're never going to get anywhere unless we're having an honest discussion about it. And as long as you have this, especially right now, I mean, the debates about the sort of political movement shifts towards the right in Israel have been going on for decades now. I remember back in the early 2000s, the discussions that were, who's left in Israel, meaning there's no more the sort of leftist politics that may have been part of the Israeli system for a long time seem to be completely absent, and this shift has occurred. But simultaneously, as this is happening, you see how it affects Palestinians. There's no, there is no peace process. When they talk about things like two-state solutions, it's like you're living in a space that no one exists in. And it's like the conversations have to move forward because the entire situation in Israel itself has changed so dramatically. And that, I think that has to be something that's addressed. So I thought the ideological point was very important.
Thank you, Assal. Hamid?
I just wanted to echo a couple of points that my colleagues made. Yesterday, I heard John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, say something very important, that you cannot bomb the memory of nuclear technology, nuclear science out of a nation. The thing that is important to understand about the nature of nuclear knowledge, nuclear technology, is Maryam Mirzakhani, the ingenious mathematician, was Iranian, the same country that produced Maryam Mirzakhani. The algorithm that is in this machine that all of us use comes from Al-Khwarizmi. From Al-Khwarizmi to Maryam Mirzakhani, there's a sustained scientific tradition in Iran, as in fact in the rest of the Muslim world. There is no way. I mean, I recently said, I do understand even the post-Holocaust anxiety of a people to be worried about a country that has slogans that they don't like, to be wary of a nuclear technology. But you don't drop bombs in order to get rid of that nuclear thing. You sit down and you talk, and you commit them to agreements. In order for that to be a legitimate project, Israel must become a signatory to NPT. Israel must declare its massive stockpiles of nuclear warheads. You cannot sit on a massive stockpile of nuclear head and then point finger at a country that does not have a nuclear warhead yet. You cannot be perpetrating tens of thousands of murders of Palestinians. As you're doing it, you're saying, oh, do you have a slogan of death to Israel and death? You are practicing death to Palestinians. You are practicing a genocide. The slogan of from the river to the sea that they are so scared of, Netanyahu and the whole production of the Likud, this is originally their, not just a slogan, is their practice that they want from the river to the sea. So you are in a very weak, not just moral, but logical position to be practicing from river to the sea and say, oh, you have this slogan and that's an anti-Semitic slogan. You cannot be practicing genocide and saying, oh, Iran might have a thing and in their constitution they say this and that. That's one thing. The second thing I want to say is about this axis of resistance business, which is not our language, is really a Washington, D.C., the present company exempted expression. The rise of Hamas, or the rise of Hezbollah, or the rise of Houthis, or the rise of any resistance movement in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, is not the work of Islamic Republic. Iran takes advantage of these things, but they don't create them. Hezbollah was created in 1982 after the Israeli invasion. Israel created Hezbollah. Israel literally created Hamas. Iran, in the geopolitics of the region, goes and takes advantage of this. So, as Barbara correctly said, you cannot disregard the root cause of all of this. Somebody has to drive this to the to make people understand. Palestinians will not give up their homeland. Period. From now to doomsday. Just go read Edward Said, or Mahmoud Darwish, or Ghassan Kanafani, or Khalil Jahshan. They will not give up their homeland. They will not give up their homeland, period. So you can start creating enemies in Iran, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen. I mean, pretty soon they will go towards Pakistan, towards thing. They keep pushing forward the boundaries of the danger that is about to happen in order to gobble up the entirety of Palestine and kill more and more in Iran Papist terminology, incremental genocide that has now been on steroid. So these two issues have to be separated. Iran is sitting on a massive technology and knowledge and know-how capacity for building a nuclear infrastructure. And if push comes to shove, in my opinion, right now, the push has come to shove, and they will find a deterrence on the model that Israel says, no comments, no affirmation or denial. They will go in that direction. Second, we have to understand the geopolitics of the region in which you have one pseudo superpower keep killing people. Let's not forget what happened in Lebanon. Let's not forget what happened in Iraq or in Yemen. And then they're saying, oh, we want peace. What peace? There is no peace. There is impossible to have peace. Right now, as we speak, during the so-called 12 days of war with Iran, go and count how many Palestinians were slaughtered. Those are the issues. New research has been done by scholars, including scholars inside Israel, that keep pushing the boundaries of the actual number of Palestinians who have been slaughtered, that we keep saying, based on Al Jazeera counting or Gaza Ministry of Health, 10,000, 20,000, 50s, but the actual numbers are much higher. According to Lancet, a respectable medical journal, is at least 185,000. But the question is not number. The question is a defenseless people in the tens of thousands. You kill them now for almost 2 years. And then you go and say, oh, in their constitution, they say something about this and that. It just doesn't add up.
Thank you, Hamid. Let me go to Mehran. There are a couple of questions. I'm going to combine them together from Carl Goldberg. Please comment on the preamble to the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which explicitly says that they will use their armed forces not only for defense, but for fulfilling their Islamic duty of spreading Islam to the rest of the world. Why is the destruction of Israel the goal of the Islamic Republic, or is it?
I thought I just responded to that. Go on. Why is
I know you did, but just in case, Carl, I mean, knowing where that question usually comes from, I thought it might be worth kind of giving it a fuller answer, but you did, yeah. Mehran, you want to try?
Khalil, I couldn't have said it better than Hamid just did. I know Barbara and Assal want to chime in. I think Hamid just answered it beautifully. First of all, I've read the Iranian constitution. I do not think in it mentions that the Iranian military will be used to destroy Israel. But I have written about this. It's a rather incoherent document, the Constitution, which is a product of a particular period in the evolution of the Islamic Republic, when when ideology played an incredibly important role in the drafting of the document. It is contradictory because On one hand, in some articles, it says Iran will support the destitute and the downtrodden. In another article, it says Iran will not interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries. So like anything else, it depends on what you read, and you can have your own interpretations. But I'll let others.
Thank you. Yeah, Barbara, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think we do have to have a little balance here on this issue. Look, I remember in particular, now it hasn't been true all the time and from all Iranian officials, but during the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in particular, there were Holocaust denial conferences in Tehran. There were the celebration of Quds Day, the last Friday in Ramadan became much more aggressive than it had in the past. So this is part of the ideology of the Islamic State. It is a position that, frankly, is not popular, or at least until the recent war, was not that popular among many Iranians. We know the slogans, no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, my life only for Iran, which have been chanted at multiple demonstrations over the years. So I stick with my point that to some extent, Iran, by using this kind of rhetoric, by refusing to accept a two-state solution, however unrealistic that may be at this point, and by supporting groups like Hamas, admittedly not as much as Qatar did at the instigation of Bibi Netanyahu, but nevertheless supporting Hamas, which carried out such horrific attacks on October 7th, 2023, that they have traumatized Israelis to this day. Iran, you cannot absolve Iran of responsibility for the mess that we are in. There are ways to deal with the Palestinian issue that would have been far more constructive. And as much as I oppose the Israeli attacks on Iran, and I oppose the US attacks on Iran even more, we have to be honest and we have to be fair about this. If we are going to get to root causes, they are going to involve ending support for military solutions to problems that are fundamentally political.
Thank you, Barbara. Assal, and then Dan.
I mean, I think Barbara makes excellent points. It's also not, we can't paint the Iranian government as some like innocent entity either, because it is not. Certainly not when it comes to its treatment of its own domestic population. And there's a lot that can be said about its foreign policy as well. That being said, I would add something because I do think it's interesting. Specifically going back to Iran's nuclear program. This is on Iran's nuclear program. Iran's nuclear program predates the Islamic Republic. And the reason why this is so important to know is because the monarchy was clearly pro-West, was a staunch ally of the United States, perfectly fine relations with Israel, did not have anything in its constitution or charter about that was negative towards Israel in any way. And yet, when he pushed for having an independent nuclear program, much like the Islamic Republic is doing. I mean, the Islamic Republic's take on the nuclear program is continuity with the monarchy. It was not met by the United States. It was not welcomed by the United States. So it's not just a question of the ideology of the Islamic Republic. It is the fact that what Iran does is not challenge, it's not an existential threat to Israel. It's a challenge to Israel's hegemony in the region. And that's why it doesn't matter who is in power. Even when it was the monarchy, which was pro-Western and pro-Israel, or had good relations with Israel, I should say. I mean, the Shah was critical of certain things as well. But even when you had that kind of government in Iran, the idea of it having an independent nuclear program was not met with, open arms. And that is because US policy, US doctrine is that Israel has to have a military edge in the region. What does that mean? That means basically the US is saying Israel has to be the hegemon of the region. No one else can compete with them. And that is not a sustainable situation for every other state in the region. And that's why if, for instance, Iran, right now you already see without a weaponization program, the fact that states like Saudi Arabia are saying, well, we should have nuclear technology as well. We should have reactors. We should have these things because it's a question of competitiveness within the region. And so I think while the ideological aspects of the Islamic Republic are important, at the same time, there's certain power politics that have nothing to do with that ideology in terms of the way that the US and Israel itself is dealing with a state like Iran.
Thank you. Dan?
Yes, just extrapolating from this discussion, I'm reminded what Henry Kissinger once said about Iran. He said the Iranian leaders can't decide whether they are a state or a cause. And, you know, that is a simplification, but of a complex reality that reminds us that in Iran, as in many states, there are multiple logics, multiple ideologies that have been part of that apparatus and that state that was created, by the way, not so long ago in 1979, for a long time. And these compete within certain arenas, and they should display different sort of projects. So it's very difficult to portray Iran as one thing. And I would make the same case for Israel. Israel is many things. It is many ideologies, many perspectives. The debate about the relationship between religion and state is very, very deeply embedded in the Israeli sort of psyche and the politics of it. And there are therefore Israelis who champion the kind of messianic message and agenda that Bibi's allies favor, and there are many that reject it. So I would really suggest that we don't get very far analytically when we portray Israel with one simplistic brush, forgetting that this is a complex community with a complex history. And yes, the memory of the Holocaust and the fears of annihilation are very real in that country. And the perception of what Iran was doing in terms of an existential threat was not contrived, it was manipulated, but is deeply embedded. If we forget that, we really we can't go anywhere. So I would make that point. The other point I would make is that despite the kind of hostility, not only to Israel, but also to Jews, you get this, I've experienced it in Iran when I was there. Khomeini said on the first page of his book, Islamic Government, that the Jews have always been the enemies of the Muslims. This is on page 1, right? There's that deep strain. But when we look at the ideology and we look at the practice, as I've written extensively, Khalil, you know, for the Arab Center, I think that Iran's approach has been essentially no war, no peace, no peace, no war. It didn't want to engage in a confrontation with Israel, didn't want to engage in a confrontation with the United States. It was essentially a defensive posture using its allies in the region. That posture was stripped away by Israel and the United States. So the axis of resistance, or whatever you wish to call it, was damaged severely, leaving Iran in a perplexing situation in terms of how to defend its own strategic interest. And that's where we are today. My concern is that where we are today will leave Iran leaders concluding, as many of my colleagues have suggested, that the only way to defend those interests now, particularly given the absence of allies in the region, particularly Hezbollah, that can serve as a deterrent, that the only path for Iran to take is move openly to some sort of nuclear weapons capacity.
Okay. Hamid.
I just want to say something about this ridiculous Ahmadinejad's memory of putting together these cartoonish events in Tehran of Holocaust denial. Denying Holocaust is a horrible, horrible thing to do. I just wrote a piece in which I denounced 2 people, Ahmadinejad for having denied Holocaust, and Bernard Lewis for having denied Armenian genocide, for which he was taken to court in France. In this article, I argue denying Palestinian genocide should also be made illegal on the model of Holocaust denial and denial of Armenian genocide. We should, as many of my colleagues have pointed out, we should keep our eyes on the ball. The ball is Palestine. The ball is Gaza right now. The fact that right here on my own campus, a group of Columbia students led by Jewish students, half of the leadership is Jewish students. You call them anti-Semites. You write articles, you have commissions and this and that. But the word genocide cannot be even uttered in the pages of New York Times unless to ridicule it and put it into scare quotes and that sort of thing. I don't think we are in disagreement that the ruling regime in Iran has in fact modeled itself on Zionism. It is, I have argued extensively that Islamism is the mirror image of Zionism. They're both products of colonialism. The issue is not to defend, I mean, I'm the last person, I can't set foot in my own homeland because of these horrors of Islamic Republic. But the issue as a result is remain consistently laser beaming or which people have suffered most. I mean, how many people, one innocent life is, I mean, right now, I was talking to Khalil before, as Iranian missiles were coming, I was calling friends and colleagues in Haifa. I have students who are in Haifa. I have students who are in Tel Aviv to wonder how they are. These countries are so interwoven. You cannot decide where is Israel and where is Palestine. It's the same thing. As I wrote in my travelogue to Palestine, the fact that in Ghubat al-Sakhre, in Wailing Wall, you pull one brick out, the thing falls out. Maybe there is a divine wisdom that there is no separating Jews and Christians and Muslims and, God bless them, atheists from each other in that space. They're all interrelated. They're all connected. So maybe that already, if there is a divine intervention, the divine intervention has been sit down, live together and start killing each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamid. Before I move away from you, there is a question for you actually from Faye Muqtadar, asking if you give any serious chance to a quick, short agreement emerging from all this talk about negotiations with the Iranians, even though the request is for them to give up in a way their defense or their missile system. Do you see any chance for a conversation emerging out of that?
You know, Khalil, the word that we use in Persian is Arabic also for a negotiation is muzakira. Just you talk, I talk. They are all for muzakira. Let's talk from now until doomsday. Of course they talk, but you have to understand there are multiple factions. Mostly the foreign ministry is under the sort of direction of constant negotiations, let's talk, etc. But they have very little control over the National Security Council, which is led mostly by the militaries, and the decisions are really by the militaries, not by the diplomatic, etc. The diplomats do their own things, but right now, as I said, Islamic Republic, the preservation of the state is paramount. They just want to protect the state because the state is in danger. When the top echelon of the military has been assassinated, the scientists have been assassinated. So the state preserves itself how? By a military coup, or there's a soft military coup or a hard military coup. So we have to separate the geopolitics of the actual national sufferings from the states. The state will preserve itself. There is a substantive body of literature in Persian. In fact, they use Dawlat Padegani, garrison state, which was initially a state created in 1940s for US as a garrison state, extended into Israel. But right now, Iran also acts as a garrison state. So that is different from, yes, negotiations will happen, a short-term solution may happen, but I think was Barbara or one of my other colleagues mentioned, Iran will not give up its right for enrichment. It's just a matter of not just national pride, but as you know, within NPT limitations, nuclear technology can be weaponizable within months. This is what they want to have capacity of, weaponizing the weapon, which might have not actually crossed the line. They want to weaponize as soon as possible.
Mehran, did you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Hamid just said. Those of you in the United States have a much better sense of American politics and particularly Donald Trump's whims. But as it was mentioned earlier, I think a lot of it depends on both the Iranian perspective, but also on the Trump administration. He just said, for example, that we may not even negotiate over, we will talk and negotiate, but maybe not over the nuclear program, because at least in his calculation, the nuclear program in Iran has been obliterated. So I think there is definitely a desire on the Iranian part to continue negotiations. During the war, Araghchi, the foreign minister, repeatedly said that we will negotiate, but first the hostilities have to end. Now the hostilities have ended. The Americans have announced that next week there's going to be renewed negotiations. And again, I think a lot depends on how emboldened or alternatively desperate the Iranian leadership feels that it would have to effect some sanctions relief, and the price that it's willing to pay or not willing to pay for sanctions relief in terms of the outcome of the negotiations.
All right.
Khalil, if I may just add one point to what Kamran
Please.
just said, which I echo. I don't know, Kamran, in the magnificent Doha, which I miss, and Souq Waqif, this beautiful food. You have heard of taco. Here in US, we have an expression for President Trump as taco. Trump always chickens out. You see, he has no consistency. He is a transactional for his own best interest. He has no foreign policy. The other day, he was using F word for Israel for the first time.
Was that falafel?
No, the other F.
Sorry.
Yeah. So we have to see what he does. I mean, as you said, the negotiate about what? You see, you just said you just eliminated all the nuclear thing. Okay, so what are the Iranians have to give in order to receive anything? So it is, I mean, he's on to the next project. Right now, he's on to the next atrocity. He doesn't have the presence of the mind. You see, the thing is his mind works like a tweet. This is how he's best at. And the tweet is just 140 characters off to the next atrocity.
Thank you. There's a question for you, Barbara. Where is Russia in all of this? Why didn't Russia help Iran in this conflict?
Yeah, well, as all of us know, Iran does not really have friends. It is a strategically lonely country. It is Persian and Shia in a Turkic and Arab Sunni sea. I forget who first wrote that, but you know, it has tried to build relationships out of necessity with other countries that are adversaries of the United States, going so far as to help the Russians in Ukraine. But in its hour of need, no, you did not see the equivalent of C-130s from Russia or China flying in supplies for Iran. There was some support, diplomatic support from the Russians and the Chinese. Putin made an offer to mediate, but concrete support, not that we've seen. Perhaps there will be in terms of rebuilding. The Russians are still very involved with Iran's civilian nuclear program. They're building some additional civilian reactors at Bushehr. And Trump made this odd statement about Iran now being free to sell its oil to China. I don't know if we're going to relax some of the sanctions enforcement that we've seen recently as a result of Iran accepting a ceasefire. That remains to be seen. I think Iran is still counting on the U.S. through its various actions, weakening itself and becoming less of a dominant factor on the international scene, and that it's made the right bet in trying to strengthen relations with Russia and China, and that China in particular is the rising power in the world. So this is a long-term bet, and we'll see how it turns out for Iran. But in the immediate term, no, there was no concrete support that I could see.
Thank you. Dan?
Well, just extrapolating from that, the extraordinary thing about Iran's assumption is that it was assuming that we live in a multipolar world in which Russia and China, acting individually or together, can counter U.S. power, and therefore it's a changed political system. And I think the U.S. attack on Iran raises significant questions about those assumptions and suggests that in many respects, despite the assumption that we live in a multipolar world now, that the United States is in some sense the dominant military power, can exercise influence in certain regions. It's a unipolar system in many respects. The problem, of course, as we've seen in the last few days, is we don't know what to do. Trump doesn't know what to do with that power. Nor do the leaders, the particular leaders of Israel that I've been addressing. And so having all that power, having demonstrated that it can attack, perhaps obliterate, whatever, Trump stands there, and to echo Hamid, without any emotional, psychological, political, strategic concept of what to do with that power. And it's that absence of any kind of coherence, fed by his own advisors who are scared of challenging Trump, who feel that if they say anything, they're going to be out of the scene. Trump has been enabled by his advisors. In Trump 1, that was very different, right? People actually left the administration. Nobody leaves. Everybody stays. Everybody circles the wagon, and everybody protects Trump's narcissism and Trump's ego. And as long as that happens, and of course, the other side of the coin has been mentioned, that is Trump does not want to alienate his right-wing basis. That's one reason why, in fact, he stood away from the conflict. That's an important strategic consideration. It reminds us that Trump is not completely irrational, but there's a deep vein of irrationality that comes with the Trump package. And this has immediate effects on our relations, not only, of course, in the Middle East, but as we've seen in the last few days, our relations with our European allies.
Thank you. Assal, I noticed we talked about that the other day in a private conversation, but the Iranian community here in the United States apparently just conducted a poll that NIAC just did. I don't know if you saw the poll where a majority of Iranian Americans did oppose U.S. military action against Iran. Is this related to what Hamid mentioned earlier and others alluded to it, that essentially ideology is not really the dominant factor right now in how Iranians in the diaspora particularly feel about this conflict? It's the aggression, if you will, or unjustified, unprovoked attack on Iran that bothers them more than anything else. Would you like to comment on that?
I think it's the unprovoked nature of the attack, but also just an attack. One of the things, and Professor Dabashi mentioned this earlier, if you are aware of sort of Iranian history and the Iranian psyche, it's not, people use the phrase rallying around the flag effect. And I would say it's more that they're rallying around the homeland. Right, the idea of Vatan, homeland for Iranians is, and this is true of, I hate to create this sort of exceptionalism when it comes to Iranians. Any nation state, any modern nation state with a peoples will want to defend its borders, regardless of the opinions that they hold of their own governments. This is just particularly heightened with Iranians because they see their history as part of the same nation. Now, obviously, the modern nation state is only a couple of centuries old, but they see Iran as a 2,500-year-old nation. And that vast and rich history is something that they can tap into, different aspects of it. It's a diverse history that they can tap into. And so I forgot who mentioned the Jerusalem Post article. I think it was Mehran who mentioned the Jerusalem Post article, where at one point it mentioned the idea of partitioning Iran. And nothing, and I mean nothing, will get Iranians everywhere in the world, in Iran and in the diaspora, more up in arms than the idea of touching that map. The idea of breaking it apart is something that will unite pretty much everybody. And I think that's the kind of sentiment that you're seeing, that while especially in the diaspora, there's a lot of support for pressure on the Islamic Republic. That is not the same thing as Israel bombing Iran. And the last thing I'll add to this is the context. We cannot forget the context that we're in, a genocide in Gaza. I think it's very different. If this was happening 2 years ago, I think we're in a very different situation than the fact that it's happening now. Because when you think about the idea that Israel could possibly be a liberator, that could possibly be carrying out these attacks in service of the Iranian people, is absurd on its face. When you add the fact that they are, during that period that their war of aggression on Iran, they were slaughtering Palestinians. I mean, you had 870 Palestinians killed during this 12-day period, which got barely any coverage anywhere. So the idea that someone that has so little regard for human life that you would mass slaughter children is somehow there to be your liberator, I think that has sort of exacerbated the already context from the Iranians, which is defensive by its own nature.
Mehran, would you like to conclude our event today? I'll give you a minute or two. Our time is up, but please go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to add to what Assal just said. For the last hour and a half, we've been talking about people who have really suffered. Civilians in Iran, civilians in Israel, of course, the genocide, and everybody has lost. But I just want to highlight one set of losers that we haven't mentioned yet, and that's the opposition in diaspora, and not just the Iranian opposition in diaspora in general, but the monarchist opposition in particular, the son of the late Shah, who came out wholeheartedly in support of the attack and kind of endorsing Bibi Netanyahu's aggression against Iran. If there was ever any doubt that there's no chance of him ever going to Iran, which there never was any doubt, this was the death knell that kind of put that doubt to rest. And I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you very much.
One tiny thing. I'm so sorry.
Yes, go ahead, please, real quick.
I think it's also a death knell for their argument that they care about human rights or democracy anywhere in the world. You cannot support a genocide and come out and say you care about women's rights anywhere on this planet. And I think it's the death knell for that statement as well.
A bit of consistency would help across the board. Thank you guys very much. Hamid, thank you so much for joining us today. I know it was a busy day for you. Mehran, Dan, Barbara, Assal, thank you all so much for your
I
contribution.
also want to add my thank to you, Khalil, for including me in this conversation. It's an absolute pleasure to listen to all of my colleagues, but I want to particularly mention Assal because I'm a fan of her work. And you see, when I went to vote the other day, I went with my youngest daughter, and I just did whatever she told me to do. There is a sigh of relief when you see a younger generation of scholars building on work that sort of we old goats did a generation ago, but pushing it forward with such intelligence, precision, that is absolutely delightful to behold. So bravo to you, Assal, and your generation and the scholarship that Mehran has been doing for other, and all of you. Daniel, I still remember your work on Pastaran. I remember, of course, with admiration, Barbara's work, all of them. I'm delighted and grateful to you, Khalil, for including me in this conversation.
You're most welcome. And from this old goat here in Washington,
This old goat.
thank you to all of those of you hundreds of you who joined us today. And we hope to have you again in a future webinar.